The military hospital at Fort Henderson buzzed with controlled chaos on that humid Tuesday morning in June. Nurses hustled between patient rooms while orderlies pushed gurneys down the wide corridors. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of cafeteria coffee. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the nurses' station on the third floor, reviewing charts for her morning rounds. At 42, she had spent the last 18 years perfecting her craft as a trauma surgeon. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often fooled people into thinking she was soft. They were wrong. Sarah had joined the Army right out of medical school, driven by a desire to serve and to prove herself in a field dominated by men. She had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, operating in field hospitals under conditions that would make most surgeons quit. She had saved countless lives with steady hands and nerves of steel. But today, like most days at Fort Henderson, she faced a different kind of battle. "Dr. Chen, we need you in the ER," the charge nurse called out. "Motor vehicle accident, multiple casualties coming in." Sarah grabbed her tablet and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. Dark circles under her eyes showed the exhaustion from last night's emergency surgery. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her white coat bore the insignia of her rank, Major. The emergency room exploded with activity when she arrived. Paramedics wheeled in the first patient, a young soldier whose leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Sarah moved quickly, assessing the damage while barking orders to her team. "Get me an X-ray and prep or two. We need to stabilize that fracture before we lose the limb." Her team moved like a well-oiled machine. They had learned to trust her judgment without question. Sarah had earned that trust through hundreds of successful surgeries and a track record that spoke for itself. She was scrubbing in for surgery when the hospital administrator, Colonel Morrison, appeared at the OR entrance. His face was flushed, and sweat beaded on his forehead. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation." Sarah looked up from the sink, her hands covered in soap. "I'm about to operate, Colonel." "Dr. Patterson can take over. You need to come with me, now." Sarah's jaw tightened. Dr. David Patterson was competent, but he was also the Colonel's nephew. Morrison had a habit of pushing Patterson forward at every opportunity, despite Sarah's superior skills and experience. "This patient needs immediate attention, sir. The compound fracture." "Patterson can handle it," Morrison interrupted. "General Hawthorne is being brought in. He was in that accident. He's demanding our best surgeon, and I need you to brief the team." Sarah's heart sank. General Marcus Hawthorne was a legend at Fort Henderson, a decorated war hero with 3 stars on his shoulder and a reputation for being both brilliant and impossibly difficult. If he was injured, every doctor in the hospital would be under a microscope. She dried her hands and followed Morrison down the hallway. He walked quickly, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Severe abdominal trauma, possible internal bleeding." He was conscious at the scene, demanding to know who would be operating on him. They reached the administrative wing, and Morrison ushered her into his office. Dr. Charles Brennan was already there, standing by the window. Brennan was the hospital's chief of surgery, a silver-haired man in his 60s with a reputation that had long since faded. He had been a decent surgeon once, but his skills had dulled with age and ego. "Ah, Dr. Chen," Brennan said, turning from the window. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Colonel Morrison tells me we have a VIP patient." "General Hawthorne," Sarah confirmed. "I'm ready to operate as soon as he arrives." Brennan and Morrison exchanged a glance that made Sarah's stomach twist. "Actually," Brennan said slowly, "I'll be taking the lead on this one. You'll assist." Sarah stared at him. "Sir, with all due respect, I have more recent trauma experience. My success rate with abdominal injuries is 97%. I should be the primary surgeon." Brennan's face hardened. Your success rate is noted, Major, but General Hawthorne is expecting the chief of surgery. He asked specifically for our most experienced doctor. That would be me." The words hung in the air like a slap. Sarah had been passed over before, watching less qualified men take credit for her work. But this was different. This was a patient's life hanging in the balance, and ego was getting in the way of proper care. "Dr. Brennan," she said carefully, "when was the last time you performed an emergency trauma surgery?" His eyes flashed with anger. "Are you questioning my abilities, Major?" "I'm questioning whether we're making the right decision for the patient." Morrison stepped between them. "That's enough, Dr. Chen. The decision has been made. You will assist Dr. Brennan. Those are your orders." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to fight for what she knew was right. But years of military discipline held her tongue. She saluted stiffly. "Yes, sir." The ambulance arrived 15 minutes later. Sarah stood in the trauma bay with Brennan and the surgical team, watching as the paramedics rushed in with their patient. General Hawthorne was a large man, even lying on a gurney. His gray hair was matted with blood, and his face was contorted in pain. But his eyes were sharp and alert. "Where's my surgeon?" he barked at the paramedic. "Right here, sir." Brennan stepped forward, his chest puffed out. "I'm Dr. Charles Brennan, Chief of Surgery. I'll be taking care of you." Hawthorne's eyes scanned the room and landed on Sarah. "Who's that?" "Major Sarah Chen," Brennan said dismissively. "She'll be assisting." "A woman," Hawthorne's lip curled. "I asked for your best surgeon, not some." "I assure you, General," Brennan interrupted smoothly, "I have 30 years of experience. You're in the best possible hands." Sarah bit the inside of her cheek and said nothing. She had heard it all before. The doubt, the dismissal, the assumption that her gender somehow made her less capable. She had stopped trying to prove herself with words long ago. Her work spoke for itself. They wheeled Hawthorne into the operating room. Sarah scrubbed in beside Brennan, her mind already running through the procedure. Abdominal trauma could mean anything from a ruptured spleen to a lacerated liver. They would need to move quickly and precisely. But as the surgery began, Sarah's worst fears materialized. Brennan's hands trembled slightly as he made the initial incision. His movements were slow, hesitant. When they opened the abdomen and found the source of bleeding, a torn mesenteric artery, Brennan froze. "Suction," he said, his voice uncertain. "I need better visualization." Sarah moved in with the suction, clearing the blood. She could see the tear clearly, could see exactly what needed to be done. But protocol demanded she defer to the primary surgeon. "Dr. Brennan, the artery needs immediate clamping and repair. We're losing too much blood." "I can see that, Major," he snapped, but his hands continued to shake as he reached for the clamp. He fumbled it. The clamp slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the tray. The anesthesiologist called out, blood pressure dropping, 80/50. Sarah's heart pounded. Every second counted. She looked at Brennan, saw the sweat dripping down his face, saw the panic in his eyes. "Sir, let me." "I've got it," Brennan insisted. He grabbed another clamp, but his movements were clumsy, desperate. "Pressure's at 70/40, the anesthesiologist warned. "We're losing him." Sarah made a decision. She reached across the table, her hands moving with practiced speed. She clamped the artery, stopping the bleeding with one smooth motion. Then she began the delicate work of repairing the tear, her stitches small and precise. Brennan stepped back, his face red with humiliation and anger. "What do you think you're doing, Major?" "Saving his life, sir," Sarah said without looking up. Her focus was absolute, her hands steady. The repair took 20 minutes. When it was done, the bleeding had stopped, and Hawthorne's vital signs began to stabilize. "Pressure's coming back up," the anesthesiologist reported. 90/60, 100/70. Sarah finished closing the abdomen while Brennan stood to the side, silent and seething. When the last suture was in place, She stepped back and stripped off her gloves. "Surgery complete," she said quietly. "Patient stable." The OR team began the process of transferring Hawthorne to recovery. Sarah left the operating room and headed for the locker room, exhaustion washing over her. She had saved a man's life, but she knew what was coming next. She was right. 20 minutes later, Colonel Morrison summoned her to his office. Brennan was already there, along with two other senior officers. "Major Chen," Morrison began, his voice cold. "Dr. Brennan has filed a formal complaint. He says you deliberately undermined his authority in the operating room and violated the chain of command." Sarah stood at attention. "Sir, General Hawthorne was dying. I did what was necessary to save his life." "You overstepped," Brennan said, his voice shaking with rage. "You humiliated me in front of my team. You violated every protocol we have." "The patient is alive," Sarah said simply. Morrison slammed his hand on the desk. "That's not the point, Major. You disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer. There will be consequences." Sarah felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest. She had done the right thing, saved a life, and now she was being punished for it. "What consequences, sir?" Morrison and Brennan exchanged another one of those looks. "You're being removed from surgical duty pending an investigation," Morrison said. "You'll be reassigned to administrative work until further notice." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Administrative work, paperwork and scheduling while her skills went to waste, while patients who needed her were treated by lesser surgeons. "Sir, I respectfully request." "Request denied. You're dismissed, Major." Sarah saluted and left the office, her mind reeling. She had given everything to the Army, to her patients, to her profession, and this was how they repaid her. She walked out of the hospital into the late afternoon sun, feeling more alone than she had in years. But Sarah Chen was a survivor. She had faced worse than this and come out stronger. She would find a way through this too. 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and humiliation. Sarah spent her days in a windowless office, reviewing supply orders and scheduling appointments. The work that once filled her with purpose now felt like a prison sentence. Every morning, she watched her colleagues head to the operating rooms while she sorted through requisition forms. Every afternoon, she heard the overhead pages calling for surgical teams, knowing she should be among them. The hospital grapevine buzzed with gossip. Some nurses whispered that she had been right to take over from Brennan. Others said she was too aggressive, too ambitious. A few of the male surgeons made jokes about women who couldn't follow orders. Sarah ignored them all and focused on surviving each day. General Hawthorne had recovered well from his surgery. He was transferred to Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington for continued care, never knowing that the surgeon who had saved his life was being punished for it. On the 15th day of her exile, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Captain Jennifer Walsh was one of the OR nurses who had been in the room during Hawthorne's surgery. She was young, barely 30, with red hair and a fierce loyalty to good medicine. She appeared at Sarah's office door during lunch break, looking nervous. "Dr. Chen, do you have a minute?" Sarah looked up from her sandwich. "Of course, come in." Jennifer closed the door behind her and sat down. She fidgeted with her hands for a moment before speaking. "What they're doing to you isn't right," she said quietly. "Everyone knows it." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I appreciate that, Jennifer, but there's not much anyone can do about it." "Actually, there might be." Jennifer leaned forward. "I've been talking to some of the other nurses. We were all in that OR. We all saw what happened. Dr. Brennan was losing the patient and you saved him. We're willing to testify to that." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, then died. "The investigation is controlled by Morrison and Brennan. They won't let it go any further than they have to." Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed Sarah an email. "General Hawthorne sent this to the hospital last week. He wanted to thank his surgical team personally. He asked for the names of everyone who was in the OR that day. Sarah read the email, her heart beating faster. Hawthorne wanted to know who had saved his life. Morrison had responded with only Brennan's name. "That's a lie," Jennifer said, her voice hard. "And if the general knew the truth, if he knew what they did to you after you saved him—" "He's a 3-star general," Sarah interrupted. "He's not going to get involved in a hospital dispute over a surgeon he doesn't even know." "Maybe not, but he deserves to know the truth, don't you think?" Sarah stared at the email, weighing the risks. Going around Morrison and Brennan could end her career entirely. But sitting in this office, watching her skills rust while politics and ego ruled the day, was slowly destroying her anyway. "What are you suggesting?" Jennifer smiled. "I have a friend who works at Walter Reed. She can get a message to the general, a detailed account of what really happened in that operating room. That's a serious breach of protocol. So is lying about who saved his life." Sarah thought about all the years she had played by the rules, had swallowed her pride, had let lesser surgeons take credit for her work. She thought about all the patients who might die because ego mattered more than skill. "Do it," she said finally, "but make sure it's accurate. I don't want exaggerations or drama, just the facts." Jennifer nodded and stood up. "The truth is dramatic enough, Dr. Chen, trust me." After Jennifer left, Sarah tried to return to her paperwork, but her mind was racing. She had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever happened next would determine the rest of her career. 3 days later, everything exploded. Sarah was in her office when Morrison's secretary called. The colonel wanted to see her immediately. The tone in the secretary's voice told Sarah this wasn't routine. She walked to Morrison's office with her spine straight and her head high. Whatever was coming, she would face it. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found. Morrison's office was crowded. Dr. Brennan stood by the window, his face purple with rage. Colonel Morrison sat behind his desk, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. And sitting in the chair across from Morrison was a tall officer in dress uniform with 3 stars on his shoulder. General Marcus Hawthorne. He stood when Sarah entered, his steel-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back. But she held her ground and saluted. "Major Sarah Chen, reporting as ordered, sir." Hawthorne returned the salute, then gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Major." Sarah sat, aware of Morrison's glare burning into her. Hawthorne remained standing. "I received some interesting information last week. A detailed account of my surgery, written by several members of the OR team. According to them, Dr. Brennan here was about to let me bleed out on the table. And you, Major Chen, saved my life by taking over the surgery against orders." Sarah kept her face neutral. "I did what was necessary for the patient, sir." "And then you were punished for it," Hawthorne continued. "Removed from surgical duty and buried in administrative work. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Brennan spoke up, his voice shaking. "General, that account is biased and inaccurate. Major Chen violated protocol and undermined." "I've read the medical records," Hawthorne interrupted, his voice like ice. "I've talked to the anesthesiologist, the nurses, the surgical techs. Every single person in that room tells the same story, except you two." He turned to face Morrison and Brennan, and Sarah saw something in his expression that made her sit up straighter. It was fury, cold and controlled. "Let me make something very clear," Hawthorne said quietly. "I am alive because Major Chen had the courage and skill to do what needed to be done. I am alive because she put the patient first, ahead of politics and ego and chain of command. And you two repaid her by trying to destroy her career." Morrison stammered, "Sir, we were simply maintaining discipline." "You were covering up incompetence," Hawthorne snapped. "Dr. Brennan's incompetence, to be specific. Tell me, doctor, when was the last time you performed an emergency trauma surgery before mine?" Brennan's mouth opened and closed. That's not. "For years," Hawthorne said. "I had my aid check. 4 years since you last operated on anything more serious than a hernia. And yet you convinced Colonel Morrison here to let you operate on me instead of the surgeon with the best trauma record in this hospital." He turned back to Sarah. "Major Chen, I'm told your success rate with abdominal trauma is 97%. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." "And you served 2 tours in Afghanistan, operating in field hospitals?" "Yes, sir." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Then let me ask you something, Major. Why are you still here? With your record, you could be chief of surgery at any civilian hospital in the country. You could be making 3 times your military salary. Why stay?" Sarah had asked herself that question 1,000 times. She met Hawthorne's eyes and answered honestly. "Because I believe in service, sir. I joined the army to take care of soldiers, to be there when they need me most. Money doesn't matter if I'm not doing the work I'm meant to do." Something shifted in Hawthorne's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "That's the right answer," he said quietly. Then he turned to Morrison. "Colonel, effective immediately, you will reinstate Major Chen to full surgical duty. You will also launch a proper review of Dr. Brennan's surgical privileges. If he cannot demonstrate current competence, he will be reassigned to a position that doesn't put patients at risk." Morrison's face went white. "Sir, I don't have the authority." "You do now. I'm making it an order, and if you have any objections, you can discuss them with the Surgeon General. I'm having lunch with him tomorrow." The threat was clear. Morrison nodded stiffly. Hawthorne turned to Brennan. "As for you, Doctor, I suggest you think long and hard about whether your ego is worth more than your patients' lives. Because from where I'm standing, you nearly committed murder through incompetence. If I ever hear of you punishing someone for saving a life, I will make it my personal mission to end your career. Are we clear?" Brennan looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Hawthorne's eyes made him back down. "Yes, sir." "Good, now get out, both of you. I want to speak with Major Chen alone." Morrison and Brennan left quickly, closing the door behind them. Sarah remained seated, her heart pounding, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Hawthorne sat down across from her and sighed deeply. "I owe you my life, Major. That's not a debt I take lightly." "You don't owe me anything, sir. I was just doing my job." "No," he said firmly. "You went far beyond your job. You risked your career to do what was right. That takes a special kind of courage." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've been reviewing your file. Your record is remarkable. You should have been promoted to lieutenant colonel 2 years ago. The fact that you haven't been tells me that the problems in this hospital run deeper than just Brennan and Morrison." Sarah said nothing. It was true, but saying it out loud felt like crossing another line. Hawthorne seemed to read her thoughts. He smiled slightly. "You don't have to confirm it. I've been in the army long enough to know how things work. Talent doesn't always rise to the top, especially when politics gets in the way." He closed the folder and looked at her directly. "I'm going to Walter Reed next week for a follow-up examination. The chief of surgery there is an old friend of mine. They're looking for a new head of trauma surgery. If you're interested, I can arrange an interview." Sarah's breath caught. Walter Reed was the pinnacle of military medicine. The opportunities there, the cases, the resources, it was everything she had ever wanted. But it was also running away. "Sir, that's incredibly generous, but—" "Think about it," Hawthorne interrupted. "You've given enough to this place. Maybe it's time to go somewhere that will actually appreciate what you have to offer." He stood and extended his hand. Sarah stood as well and shook it. "Thank you, sir, for everything. Thank you, Major, for my life." After Hawthorne left, Sarah sat alone in Morrison's office, trying to process everything that had happened. She had been vindicated, but the victory felt hollow. Hawthorne was right. The problems at Fort Henderson ran deep. Being reinstated wouldn't change the culture of ego and politics that had put her in this position in the first place. But leaving felt like giving up on all the soldiers who depended on this hospital, on all the young doctors and nurses who needed someone to show them that doing the right thing mattered. Sarah didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in weeks she had hope. Sarah returned to the operating room the next morning. Word of Hawthorne's visit had spread through the hospital like wildfire, and the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Nurses greeted her with genuine smiles. Junior doctors asked her advice with new respect in their voices. Even some of the older surgeons who had ignored her before now nodded acknowledgement in the hallways. But the real change came when she scrubbed in for her first surgery since the suspension. The patient was a young sergeant who had been injured during a training exercise. A piece of shrapnel had lodged near his spine, and the surgery required precision and experience. Sarah stood at the table with her team around her, feeling the familiar focus settle over her like a comfortable coat. Dr. Patterson was assisting, and Sarah could see the nervousness in his eyes. He had heard what happened to Brennan. Everyone had. "Ready when you are, Major," he said quietly. Sarah made the first incision with steady hands. The surgery took 3 hours, but every moment felt right. This was where she belonged, doing the work she was meant to do. When they closed, the sergeant's prognosis was excellent. Sarah stepped back from the table and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: satisfaction. In the scrub room afterward, Patterson approached her. "That was impressive, Dr. Chen. I learned more watching you today than I have in 6 months." Sarah looked at him, seeing past the colonel's nephew to the young surgeon who was still finding his way. "You have good instincts, David. You just need more practice. Don't let anyone push you into cases you're not ready for." He understood the message. "I won't, and I'm sorry for taking over that fracture repair case when they pulled you out. I should have said something." "You were following orders, I understand that." Still, it wasn't right. Sarah appreciated the apology, but she had learned long ago that individual apologies didn't change systems. The problem wasn't David Patterson. It was the culture that put politics ahead of patients. Over the next few weeks, Sarah threw herself back into her work. She operated on soldiers injured in training, dependents who needed emergency care, and veterans dealing with complications from old wounds. Every surgery reminded her why she had joined the army in the first place. But Hawthorne's offer kept echoing in her mind. Walter Reed, a fresh start, a place where her skills would be valued from day one. She researched the position. The head of trauma surgery at Walter Reed would oversee a department of 15 surgeons, manage a budget of millions, and handle the most complex cases in the military. It was the kind of opportunity most surgeons only dreamed about. But it meant leaving Fort Henderson, leaving the nurses who had stood up for her, leaving the young doctors who were starting to see her as a mentor, leaving the patients who needed someone to fight for them. Sarah was still wrestling with the decision when Colonel Morrison called her to his office a month after Hawthorne's visit. She entered cautiously, unsure what to expect. Morrison sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable. Dr. Brennan was notably absent. "Major Chen," Morrison began, his voice formal, "I wanted to inform you that Dr. Brennan has been reassigned. He'll be taking a position at a medical clinic in Alaska, focusing on general practice." Sarah kept her expression neutral. Alaska, as far from the power centers of military medicine as possible. It was a gentle exile, but an exile nonetheless. "I see, sir." Morrison cleared his throat. "I also wanted to apologize. I should have listened to you about the Hawthorne surgery. I let politics cloud my judgment, and it almost cost a man his life." The apology surprised her. Morrison had always struck her as the type who never admitted mistakes. "I appreciate that, sir." "There's something else." Morrison pulled out a folder. "Your promotion to lieutenant colonel came through. It's backdated 2 years with full benefits. You'll also be receiving a commendation for exceptional service." Sarah took the folder, her hands trembling slightly. Lieutenant Colonel, the rank she had earned years ago, finally acknowledged. "Thank you, sir." Morrison stood and extended his hand. "You're a fine surgeon, Dr. Chen. This hospital is better with you in it." She shook his hand, surprised to find she believed him. Morrison wasn't a bad man, just one who had let the system corrupt his judgment. Maybe people could change after all. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment off base, staring at her phone. She had Hawthorne's direct number, the one he had given her in case she decided to pursue the Walter Reed position. One call, and she could leave all of this behind. Start fresh somewhere that would value her from the beginning. But as she looked around her apartment, at the photos of soldiers she had saved, at the thank you cards from grateful patients, at the awards she had earned through years of dedicated service, Sarah realized something. She didn't want to run away anymore. Fort Henderson needed her, not because she was the best surgeon, though she was, but because she represented something important. The idea that doing the right thing mattered more than politics, that skill mattered more than ego, that patience mattered most of all. If she left, who would fight for those principles? Who would mentor the young doctors and stand up to the administrators when they made bad decisions? Sarah picked up her phone and dialed. Hawthorne answered on the second ring. "Major Chen, I was hoping to hear from you." "General, I wanted to thank you again for the Walter Reed opportunity, but I've decided to stay at Fort Henderson." There was a pause. "May I ask why?" "Because the fight here isn't finished, sir. Fort Henderson needs someone who will put patients first, who will stand up for what's right even when it's hard. I think I can be that person." Hawthorne's laugh was warm and genuine. "You know what, Major? I think you already are that person, and Fort Henderson is damn lucky to have you." "Thank you, sir." "One more thing. I'm putting you up for the Army Commendation Medal for your actions during my surgery. It won't change what you went through, but it will put your name and your story on record. Maybe it will make the next Sarah Chen's path a little easier." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "That means a lot, sir." "You earned it. Take care of yourself, Major. And if you ever change your mind about Walter Reed, the offer stands." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She had faced injustice and fought back. She had risked everything to do what was right, and somehow it had worked out. But more importantly, she had learned that change didn't always mean running to something new. Sometimes it meant standing firm and making things better where you were. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital early, as always. She made her rounds, checked on post-op patients, and prepared for the day's surgeries. In the OR, a young corporal waited for an appendectomy. Simple procedure, routine surgery. But to him, lying on that table, scared and in pain, it was everything. Sarah scrubbed in and approached the table with her team behind her. The corporal looked up at her with frightened eyes. "Am I going to be okay, ma'am?" Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're in good hands, soldier, I promise." As the anesthesia took effect and the corporal's eyes closed, Sarah felt the familiar surge of purpose. This was why she became a surgeon, not for recognition or promotion or accolades, but for this moment, for the chance to heal, to help, to save. She picked up her scalpel and began to work. 6 months later, Sarah stood on a small stage in the hospital auditorium. The room was packed with doctors, nurses, and hospital staff. General Hawthorne sat in the front row, smiling. Morrison stood beside her, reading from a formal citation. For exceptional courage and skill in the performance of surgical duties, for placing the welfare of patients above personal interest, and for exemplifying the highest standards of military medicine, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen is hereby awarded the Army Commendation Medal. He pinned the medal to her uniform while the audience applauded. Sarah looked out at the faces watching her. Jennifer Walsh grinning in the third row, Dr. Patterson standing with the other surgeons, patients she had saved scattered throughout the crowd. But the moment that meant the most came after the ceremony, when a young female doctor approached her nervously. "Colonel Chen, I'm Captain Lisa Torres. I just transferred here from Fort Bragg. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that it's possible. I'm the only female surgeon in my department and I've been struggling. But when I heard your story, heard how you stood up for what was right even when it cost you everything, it gave me courage to keep fighting." Sarah looked at this young doctor and saw herself 10 years ago, full of idealism and determination, not yet worn down by politics and prejudice. "Never let them make you smaller than you are," Sarah said quietly. "Your patients need you to be brave, and the Army needs doctors who remember why we're really here." Torres smiled, tears in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." As Torres walked away, Hawthorne appeared at Sarah's elbow. "Making a difference already, I see." "Just doing my job, sir." "No," Hawthorne said seriously. "You're doing much more than that. You're changing the culture one person at a time. That's leadership, Colonel." Sarah looked around the auditorium, at the hospital she had fought so hard to stay in, at the people she had fought so hard to serve. "I'm just getting started, sir." Hawthorne's smile widened. "I believe you, and God help anyone who gets in your way." That night, Sarah drove home through the quiet streets of the town near Fort Henderson. She passed the houses where military families lived, the schools where their children learned, the parks where they played. These were the people she served. These were the lives she protected. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more moments when politics tried to override principles, more times when she would have to choose between comfort and courage. But Sarah Chen had learned something important through all of this. The fight was worth it. Every patient saved, every young doctor mentored, every time she stood up for what was right, it all mattered. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the small apartment that had become home. Tomorrow she would return to the hospital, scrub in for surgery, and do the work she was meant to do.